Mr. Kay, please proceed.
Thank you, Your Honour. Moving on to trusted insider who had close personal ties. Where is the evidence of any meetings that Mr. Carrier referred to yesterday? It's not good enough to come into this courtroom and say there were public and private meetings. What? Of what? Where? The meetings that we have seen evidence of in the presidential transcripts do not reflect adversely upon Mr. Čermák in any way. That is the evidence, and they show the nature of his tasks and work. They don't show anything more or anything less. So coming into this courtroom to mention public and private meetings at which things would have been discussed is simply not good enough to build a criminal case. And the fact of the matter is they simply didn't happen. We have the evidence of the meetings and what was said, and that is where it is. In relation to other alleged members of the JCE, where is the foundation for the close personal ties between the other alleged members and General Čermák? That has not been the subject of evidence of any significant nature. What we do know is that General Čermák said in his interview he knew Mr. Young personally, he referred to him as a friend, he referred to General Markača as a friend, he said his relations with President Tudjman were good in 1993. When he left government at that stage, afterwards there was little contact between 1993 and 1995. They saw each other 2 or 3 times. In relation to the other alleged members of the JCE, General Chervenko, Ademi, others, Mr. Radin, where is it? Where is this foundation that somehow General Čermák came into an inner circle whereby he was given sufficient trust that he would go on to help and support the commission of crimes? It's simply not there. If it had been there, we would have been able to have dealt with it. In fact, the evidence shows that there was very good reason why General Čermák was chosen to go to Knin. And the citations in the footnotes of the prosecution brief actually support those good reasons that were cited by Mr. Vegas, that he was to encourage the organisation of civilian life in the area and town of Knin. Tudjman tried to find a person who had organisational skills, who could initiate rebuilding the area. Mr. Radin simply did not say that the President did not mention anybody else as a possible alternative. There's no evidence as to what was in the President's thought. The opportunity to put him on trial about these matters passed a long while ago. We simply don't know. Mr. Skegro and Mr. Vidosevic likewise emphasized the skills of Mr. Čermak, which were appropriate to be employed down in Knin from that time to try and restore an area that was to be the subject of an influx of people who'd been excluded from it for over 4 years, as well as to encourage the people who were there to stay and those who had self-evacuated to come back. And I'll be dealing with that in a little bit more detail later on. In the conversation that General Čermak had with the President in 1999 at Exhibit P1144, that conversation clearly indicates the extent of General Čermak's work, and never once did it include responsibility for law and order. It did not include responsibility for the police, the military, or anything else. That was never put to him by the President. It is an informal conversation when neither would have suspected, one would think, that such a tape would end up in a court of law 10 years later. But nowhere within that statement was there any suggestion that General Čermak had in some way not fulfilled his task in normalization, his task in reconstruction, but nowhere is it stated that he was responsible for the law enforcement in the area and responsible to have prevented crimes that happened. It's interesting that the prosecution state Čermak's appointment and role was almost also immediately circulated among Croatian officials, including senior members of the political leadership, the military and the police. But there's simply no source cited that can support that, and indeed what the evidence reveals is that Čermak was not introduced into the power structures of either the police or the power structures of the military. He was sent there on his sole and lone mission to carry out the tasks that he had been given. Nothing more, nothing less. The appointment had been discussed at the meeting when Bronze members were present. There had been no introduction into the power structures, and in fact, as Mr. Vedrish told the court, transcript page 23670, he heard the announcement on the radio, and he called Mr. Čermak, and this is interesting because it shows the state of mind of Mr. Čermak at that time. In an informal conversation, Mr. Čermak told him he'd accepted the appointment and he accepted to help. This was a role of helping, not a role of anything else, or a matter that would further advance this prosecution. The senior police officer in the area, Mr. Sipsey, who saw General Čermak arrive in Knin on the 6th, asked Mr. Jarnjak what Mr. Čermak's function was. Again, that hardly constitutes the issue of some presidential directive in some form or other circulated amongst senior Croatian officials as to Mr. Čermak's responsibility and role. I have touched on the importance of Mr. Čermak's role in the normalisation of life. What we have now in this case, because that has been absolutely and thoroughly proved and established by the defence in the course of this trial, is that the prosecution have attempted to change the nature of that task from normalisation, simple, the only phrase that was ever used, to add on in their submissions that it was to facilitate, in inverted commas, the return of Croats, close inverted commas, to the area through infrastructure protection, sanitation, mine clearance, etc. Now, the issue of colonisation as being Mr. Čermak's task and job was again never put to people like Mr. Radin, Mr. Skegro, Mr. Passage, the people who were there at the time. It was simply not a concept, because that would have been met with a straight rejection by anyone if it had been put by the prosecution, because the weight of this evidence is overwhelmingly in favour of the fact that it was normalisation, full stop. He was nothing to do with Operation Return. He was nothing to do with the MUP structure which was administering Operation Return. This concept that has been brought into this case is again a last-ditch attempt to try and make valid evidence invalid and criminally liable. And in our submission to the court, it simply doesn't work. If one goes to statements of two witnesses who had their evidence in private session, protected witnesses, if we could go into private session, please.
Move into a private session.